November 7, 1983. Rhine-Main Air Base, West Germany. 3:47 local time. The night is bitter, a damp cold seeping from the concrete tarmac. The control tower's lights cast long, anxious shadows. For days, the airbase has hummed with a tense, coiled energy. Then, a new sound fractures the twilight. A deep, tectonic groan, felt in the bones before it's heard in the ears. On the horizon, a constellation of navigation lights appears, not stars but something more urgent. The groan resolves into a thunderous, four-engine roar. The silhouette of a C-141 Starlifter, long and purposeful, materializes from the gloom. Its landing gear locks down with a hydraulic sigh. Tires scream against wet asphalt, a plume of steam rising in its wake. Before it can even clear the runway, another shadow descends. Larger. A shape that seems to defy physics. The C-5 Galaxy, a whale of the sky, its enormous nose yawning upwards. Inside its cavernous belly, not just troops, but the weight of armored war, M1 Abrams tanks, their depleted uranium armor still cold from a Texas dawn, and M2 Bradley fighting vehicles, chain guns silent for now. Ground crews in parkas sprint forward, their breath visible in the arc lights. The Galaxy's forward ramp lowers, a steel tongue tasting German soil. The first vehicle, an M113 command track, rumbles down onto sovereign NATO territory. It is followed by the disgorged crew of the 1st Cavalry Division, blinking against the foreign dark, their uniforms still creased from the long flight from Fort Hood. This is not an invasion. It is a promise. A promise written in fuel, aluminum, and political will. A promise that an entire army can cross an ocean not in weeks, but in hours. And in the frozen watchtowers along the inner German border, unseen eyes are tracking every landing, every vehicle, counting. Their reports will flash eastward, to Moscow, to the Kremlin, where old men in military uniforms will read them and feel a cold, stunning realization: the strategic map of Europe has just been redrawn, not with pens, but with the contrails of giants. This was REFORGER. And for 72 hours, the world held its breath. To understand the shockwave of that November airlift, one must first grasp the frozen geometry of the Cold War in Europe. The continent was a chessboard, divided by what Winston Churchill had famously termed the Iron Curtain. On one side, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, a defensive alliance anchored by the United States. On the other, the Warsaw Pact, a Soviet-dominated bloc whose very structure was one of offensive compulsion. The central front was Germany, itself split. The Fulda Gap, the North German Plain, these were not just geographical features, they were the anticipated killing grounds for World War III. For decades, NATO's strategy had borne an uncomfortable, open secret: its standing forces in Europe were outnumbered. The Warsaw Pact maintained a staggering quantitative advantage in tanks, artillery, and frontline troops. NATO's answer was a triad of deterrence: forward deployed troops to serve as a tripwire, tactical nuclear weapons to blunt any conventional assault, and the ultimate threat of strategic nuclear retaliation from the United States. But beneath this doctrine lay a critical vulnerability: reinforcement. The United States was separated from its European allies by the Atlantic Ocean. In a crisis, the Soviet Union and its allies could mobilize and attack with the mass of a land power. America's reinforcements would have to come by sea, a slow, weeks-long procession of transport ships vulnerable to submarine attack. This window, the gap between the outbreak of war and the arrival of substantial American heavy forces, was NATO's greatest peril. The Soviets, planners believed, might gamble on a lightning blitzkrieg to seize Western Europe before that reinforcement could tip the scales. From this dire calculus, Operation REFORGER, Return of Forces to Germany, was born in 1969. It was a logistical promise and a political statement. REFORGER was a series of annual, large-scale military exercises designed to prove that the United States could, and would, rapidly reinforce its European allies with a massive influx of combat power. The premise was simple: prepositioned stocks. Across West Germany, in sprawling depots like Pomkes, prepositioning of material configured in unit sets, sites, entire arsenals waited. Tanks, artillery, ammunition, fuel, even medical supplies, all meticulously stored, maintained, and ready for the soldiers who would fly in to claim them. The troops would arrive by air, their heavy equipment was already there, a ghost army waiting for its flesh. REFORGER exercises throughout the 1970s were impressive logistical feats. They moved tens of thousands of troops and validated the complex marriage of strategic airlift and prepositioning. But they were still, fundamentally, exercises. They followed schedules, were announced in advance, and unfolded within a Cold War context that, while frigid, had established certain rhythms of deterrence and diplomacy. The Soviet Union watched, noted, and incorporated the data into its own plans. It was a known variable on the strategic board. But the board itself was about to be upended. The late 1970s and early 1980s marked the dawn of what historians call the Second Cold War. A period of intense rearmament and rhetorical fury. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979 shattered détente. In the West, new leaders took a harder line. In 1980, Ronald Reagan was elected President of the United States, coming into office with a mandate to rebuild American military strength and confront the Soviet evil empire. In London, Margaret Thatcher provided a steadfast ideological ally. This political shift catalyzed a military one. NATO made the monumental decision to deploy new intermediate-range nuclear missiles in Europe, the American Pershing II and ground-launched cruise missiles. The Pershing II was a particular nightmare for Soviet planners. With a range of over 1,000 miles and a revolutionary radar-guided warhead capable of pinpoint accuracy, its flight time from West Germany to Moscow was estimated at a mere 8 to 12 minutes. To the Kremlin, the Pershing II was not a deterrent, it was a first-strike weapon, a sword poised to decapitate the Soviet leadership before they could even react. Its deployment, beginning in late 1983, fundamentally altered their perception of the threat. This sets the stage for the year 1983, a year that would become the most dangerous of the entire Cold War since the Cuban Missile Crisis. A year of accidents, paranoia, and deadly miscalculation. A year in which a routine REFORGER exercise would be seen through a lens of absolute Soviet terror, transforming a proof of concept into a potential trigger. 1983, the War Scare. The year unfolded like a slow-motion collision of fear and rhetoric. In March, President Reagan, in a speech to the National Association of Evangelicals, labeled the Soviet Union the focus of evil in the modern world and an evil empire. For Soviet leadership, already paranoid, this was not political theater, it was a declaration of ideological war, confirming their deepest suspicions about American intent. Then, on September 1st, the unthinkable happened. Korean Airlines Flight 007, a civilian Boeing 747, strayed hundreds of miles off course into some of the most heavily defended Soviet airspace around the Kamchatka Peninsula and Sakhalin Island. Soviet Air Defense Forces, on hair-trigger alert and convinced it was a U.S. spy plane, possibly a converted RC-135, tracked it for hours before a Sukhoi Su-15 interceptor fired 2 missiles. The airliner, with 269 civilians aboard, including a U.S. congressman, plunged into the Sea of Japan. There were no survivors. The world reacted with horror and outrage. The Reagan administration seized on the incident, releasing intercepted audio of the Soviet pilot and presenting it at the United Nations as proof of barbarity. The Soviets, shrouded in secrecy and shame, initially denied, then gave contradictory accounts. The incident convinced the U.S. that the Soviet leadership was both reckless and murderous. In Moscow, it reinforced a terrifying belief: the Americans were probing their defenses, testing their reactions, preparing the battlefield. Amid this toxic atmosphere, the Kremlin had already launched a massive, global intelligence operation codenamed Ryan, a Russian acronym for nuclear missile attack. Initiated in 1981, Ryan was not about gathering data on weapons systems, but on intent. The KGB and GRU, Soviet military intelligence, were ordered to look for subtle, non-obvious signs that the West was preparing for a surprise nuclear first strike. Orders went out to every residentiary, every agent, every officer: monitor the locations of key Western political figures and military leaders, watch for patterns of blood donations or emergency drills at hospitals, note the activation of civil defense networks, track the movement of government documents. The directive turned every routine NATO activity into a potential harbinger of Armageddon. Standard military exercises, previously viewed as predictable posturing, were now scrutinized under the lens of apocalyptic suspicion. The KGB, under the formidable and paranoid Yuri Andropov, who had become General Secretary in late 1982, was looking for a signal. They were primed to find one. It was against this backdrop of profound, institutionalized Soviet fear that NATO planned its annual command post exercise for the fall of 1983, Able Archer 83. This was not a field maneuver with troops. It was a communications and command post exercise, designed to test the procedures for the transition from conventional to nuclear warfare. It would simulate the encoded communications, the alert levels, and the decision-making chain that would be used in an actual conflict. It was, in essence, a war game played out in bunkers and over secure lines. But Able Archer 83 had a crucial, terrifying twist. To make the simulation more realistic, NATO decided to change the pattern. Previously, such exercises had used familiar, repetitive formats. For 1983, they introduced new, unique, and more realistic coded communication formats. They involved higher-level political leaders than usual. The exercise scenario would simulate a full-scale, escalating conflict, a conventional war in Europe that spirals, through a series of simulated crises, to DEFCON 1 and the eventual authorized use of nuclear weapons. Unwittingly, NATO was playing out the exact scenario Soviet intelligence was wired to detect. As Western commanders moved to secure bunkers, as communication traffic spiked with unfamiliar codes, as the simulated alert level climbed, from DEFCON 5 to 4, then to 3, the KGB and GRU stations across Europe were flashing urgent cables to Moscow Center. For them, that exercise was a perfect cover for the real thing. The very realism NATO sought was, from the Soviet perspective, indistinguishable from preparation for an actual first strike. And into this tinderbox of miscalculation, another massive exercise was scheduled. A field exercise. One that would provide the physical, tangible proof to Soviet observers that the theoretical command procedures of Able Archer were being matched by concrete military action. This was REFORGER 83, codenamed Crested Cap. Its mission, to demonstrate the rapid reinforcement of the U.S. V Corps in Germany by airlifting the 1st Cavalry Division from Fort Hood, Texas. While Able Archer simulated the decision to go nuclear, REFORGER would demonstrate the ability to flood Europe with a fresh, heavy army at blinding speed. The stage was now set. Two parallel exercises, one of command, one of force, were about to converge. In the wargamed corridors of NATO, they were tests of procedure and logistics. In the panicked minds of the Soviet High Command, they were the final, confirmatory movements of a dagger being raised. The 72-hour clock was set to start. The world was balanced on a knife edge of perception, where the most powerful demonstration of American logistical might could be misinterpreted as the opening act of annihilation. In the sprawling, sun-baked training grounds of Fort Hood, Texas, the soldiers of the 1st Cavalry Division, the first team, received their warning orders. For many, it was just another major exercise, the culmination of months of training. They were the test subjects for the Airland Battle Doctrine, a new way of thinking that emphasized agility, deep strikes, and fighting outnumbered and winning. But the scale of this movement order was different. These were not infantrymen light on their feet. They were tank crews, artillerymen, Bradley scouts, and combat engineers. Their world was measured in tons of steel and gallons of diesel. Their personal gear was a secondary concern to the maintenance of their vehicles. Now, they were told they would leave those vehicles behind. They would board aircraft, fly across an ocean, and be united with different tanks and fighting vehicles, identical in model, but strangers in serial number, waiting for them in German forests. It was an act of profound logistical faith. The human process was a marvel of controlled chaos. At the division's departure airfields, soldiers underwent stringent weapons and baggage checks. They were processed through mobile personnel processing centers, their records digitized, a cutting-edge procedure for the time. They moved in chocks, predefined groups matched to specific aircraft. For 72 hours, their lives were reduced to waiting on hard benches, marching in formation onto cavernous aircraft, and enduring the deafening, monotonous roar of turbofan engines. Inside the C-141s and C-5s, they sat in webbed seating along the fuselage, trying to sleep, write letters, or play cards in the dim red light. The air was cold, thin, and smelled of jet fuel and sweat. They were cargo, human cargo, being express shipped to a theoretical war. Their morale was a key component of the exercise. A sullen, confused force arriving in Germany would negate the entire point. So, amidst the bureaucracy, the message was hammered home: you are the proof. You are the promise. Your speed is the deterrent. The true star of REFORGER was not the soldier, nor the tank, but the aircraft that married them to the battlefield. The Lockheed C-141 Starlifter was the workhorse. With its distinctive, pencil-thin fuselage and high-set wings, it could carry over 60,000 pounds of cargo or 154 fully equipped troops, landing on short, austere runways. It was the backbone of the military airlift command, a reliable, ubiquitous presence. But it was the Lockheed C-5 Galaxy that defied imagination. It was, and remains, one of the largest aircraft in the world. Its statistics read like hyperbole: a wingspan longer than the Wright brothers' first flight, a cargo hold taller than a three-story house, a nose and aft ramp that both opened, allowing drive-through loading. It could lift two M1 Abrams tanks, each weighing over 60 tons. Or a mix of armored vehicles, helicopters, and hundreds of troops. Its landing gear system was a ballet of hydraulics, with 28 wheels that could kneel the aircraft, lowering the cargo deck to truck bed height for easier loading. The logistics of the airlift were a precise, global ballet. The Civil Reserve Air Fleet, CRAF, was activated, bringing commercial wide-body airliners like 747s and DC-10s into service to ferry the bulk of the personnel, freeing the military aircraft for the outsized cargo. The routes were calculated to the minute, a constant shuttle stream across the Atlantic air corridors. Airmen worked around the clock at the bare base ramps in Germany, performing rapid, hot refueling, with engines running to turn the aircraft around in under an hour. Every movement was tracked on giant status boards, a symphony of moving parts conducted from the Military Airlift Command's headquarters. This was not just transportation, it was the physical manifestation of America's global reach, a capability no other nation on Earth could replicate at this scale. It turned geography from a barrier into a highway. We have seen the human cargo and the machines that carried them. Now, we must shift our gaze to the observers of this feat, and the strategic minds who orchestrated it, to understand the full weight of the moment. While the C-5s descended into Rhine-Main, a different kind of tension gripped the other side of the Iron Curtain. For the Soviet military liaison missions, the so-called legal spies, permitted under post-war agreements to travel in restricted areas of West Germany, REFORGER 83 was not an exercise. It was the ultimate intelligence harvest. From camouflaged vans and forest overlooks, GRU officers with long lenses and sophisticated listening equipment documented every arrival. They counted aircraft serial numbers. They photographed the M1 Abrams as they rolled down the ramps, noting their unfamiliar, angular turrets and the distinct smell of their gas turbine engines, a stark contrast to the diesel fumes of Soviet armor. These raw observations fed directly into the paranoid ecosystem of Operation Ryan. In Moscow, the reports were not filed under logistics demonstration. They were cross-referenced with the alarming signals from Able Archer, the movement of political leaders, the unusual radio traffic. The sheer speed of the airlift was the most terrifying data point. Soviet war planning was methodical, massive, and deliberate, reliant on phased mobilizations and railway timetables. What they witnessed in those 72 hours was a capability that bypassed all of that. It suggested the United States could achieve strategic surprise not with missiles alone, but with a fully constituted heavy corps, appearing almost overnight. To the Soviet General Staff, this meant the dreaded, decapitating strike scenario was now logistically plausible, a blinding nuclear first strike to cripple command and control, followed not by an invasion fleet in weeks, but by an air-delivered army in days to mop up and occupy. The stunned reaction referenced in our title was not mere surprise, it was a profound, systemic shock that challenged their fundamental understanding of warfare's timeline. In the offices of the Pentagon and NATO's Supreme Headquarters Allied Powers Europe, SHAPE, a delicate calculus was being performed. The architects of REFORGER and Able Archer knew the exercises were provocative. They had to be. Deterrence, in the Cold War logic, only worked if it was credible. The point was to demonstrate capability and resolve to the Soviets, to dissuade them from any aggressive move by showcasing the futility and catastrophic cost of such an action. The message to allies, particularly a wary Western Europe living under the Soviet shadow, was equally vital: America's commitment is real, tangible, and fast. But there was a razor's edge. How realistic was too realistic? How much muscle flexing might be seen as preparing to throw a punch? Senior commanders and civilian leaders were acutely aware of the tensions of 1983. The decision to proceed with both exercises concurrently, at full scale, was a conscious one. It represented a shift towards a more assertive, demonstrative form of deterrence, a direct reflection of the Reagan administration's harder line. They were betting that Soviet caution would outweigh Soviet paranoia. They were testing not just their own logistics, but the nerves of their adversary. It was a high-stakes gamble, rooted in the belief that the Kremlin, for all its bluster, was a rational actor that would ultimately back down from the brink when confronted with undeniable evidence of NATO's readiness and unity. The command decision was, therefore, a blend of military necessity and psychological warfare, where the movement of divisions was as much a signal as a strategic maneuver. Beyond the military logistics and intelligence games, REFORGER 83 was a masterclass in political theater on a global stage. For the American public, images of mighty galaxies disgorging tanks onto European soil were a powerful reassurance, a tangible return on the vast investment in defense spending. It played to a narrative of restored American strength and technological supremacy. For the NATO allies, particularly the West German government hosting this flood of men and material, the exercise was a double-edged sword. It provided undeniable reassurance of the American security guarantee, a vital political counterweight to the powerful peace movements protesting the Pershing II deployments. Yet, it also made their territory the explicit front line, highlighting the terrifying reality that any war would be fought and obliterated on their soil. The West German government had to publicly champion the exercise while privately managing deep public anxiety. For the global non-aligned world, it was a stark display of superpower reach, a reminder that the Cold War was a global contest where lines drawn in Europe could extend anywhere. And for the Soviet Union, as intended, it was the centerpiece of a coercive diplomatic signal. Every landing was a line in an ultimatum written not on paper, but in the sky: we can do this faster than you can imagine. Do not test us. The political theater of the airlift was, in essence, the performance of a new, unsettling truth in the balance of power. These converging angles, the human, the technological, the adversarial, the strategic, and the political, created a moment of unparalleled intensity. The stage was set, the players were in motion, and the clock was ticking down. The theoretical was about to become terrifyingly concrete. The 72-hour clock starts. The order flashed from the Military Airlift Command's command center at Scott Air Force Base, Illinois. It was not a declaration of war, but in its execution, it mimicked one. At Fort Hood's Gray Army Airfield and nearby commercial airfields, the first phase of the meticulously crafted time-distance plan snapped into action. The date was November 5, 1983. The exercise, Crested Cap, was beginning in earnest, running parallel to the escalating command post drama of Able Archer. The first aircraft to spin up its engines was a C-141 Starlifter, its loadmasters having already overseen the careful parking of palletized gear, ammunition, and support equipment in its cavernous hold. Behind it, the true giants stirred. A C-5 Galaxy, its nose visor retracting upwards like the jaw of a prehistoric creature, awaited its unique cargo. One by one, M2 Bradley fighting vehicles and M109 self-propelled howitzers were driven up the ramp into its belly, chained and checked with ritualistic precision. The air crews, briefed and aware of the larger geopolitical tension, conducted their pre-flight checks with a grim focus that transcended a normal exercise. Across the Atlantic, at the Pommes sites in West Germany, sprawling, fenced compounds at locations like Miso, Dulmen, and Germersheim, a parallel awakening occurred. German and American depot teams began the final checks on the prepositioned equipment. Row upon row of M1 Abrams tanks, shrouded in preservative grease and tarpaulins, were stirred from their cold sleep. Maintenance crews armed with steam cleaners and rags began the laborious process of degreasing, checking fluid levels, and installing batteries. These ghost vehicles were being prepared for their new, temporary owners who were currently streaking across the stratosphere. The air bridge itself was a feat of orchestrated chaos. The Atlantic air corridors became a conveyor belt of American power. C-141s and C-5s took off at intervals calculated not in hours, but in minutes, forming a continuous stream. They flew the northern Great Circle routes, buffeted by winter winds, their navigation systems tuned to avoid commercial airways. In their pressurized holds, the soldiers of the 1st Cavalry tried to rest, the constant drone of the engines a physical presence. The air was thin, dry, and cold. Meals were reheated in boxes. There was no view, only the sense of immense, purposeful motion. As the first wave of aircraft began their descent into the Rhine-Main and Hahn Air Base complexes in the early hours of November 7, the operational tempo shifted from strategic movement to tactical reception. The port of debarkation was not a calm harbor, but a frenetic, floodlit expanse of tarmac. Ground crews, having been on standby for hours, swarmed the aircraft the moment their engines wind down. The concept of rapid turnaround was pushed to its limits. Refueling trucks hooked up to wing ports while the rear ramps were still lowering. The roar of kerosene-fueled huffers, external air starters, filled the air to restart engines for the return flight. The aircraft were not parking, they were pausing. And then, the moment of truth. The Galaxy's ramp touched down. From the gloom of its hold, a low rumble emerged. The distinctive, squared-off silhouette of an M1 Abrams appeared at the crest of the ramp, its turbine engine whining to a higher pitch as it inched forward. Its tracks made first contact with German soil not as part of an invasion, but as part of a promise kept. It was followed by another, and another. These were not the soldiers' own tanks from Texas, but fresh, unfamiliar ones from the Pommes stocks. Crews, bleary-eyed from the flight, descended and immediately began their marriage to the new vehicles, conducting pre-combat checks, loading personal gear, and studying the vehicle logbooks. The theoretical concept of fly-to-fight was being measured in real time. Could a tank crew, meeting its vehicle for the first time on a foreign airfield in the middle of the night, be ready to move out to a defensive position within hours? The credibility of NATO's entire European defense strategy hinged on the answer being yes. The machinery of reinforcement was now operating at a terrifying, flawless rhythm. But the true turning point was not occurring on the tarmac, it was happening in the minds of the men watching from the shadows, and in the sealed command bunkers where the simulated war was reaching its peak. Iron on the ramp, the crossing of the threshold. By the second day, November 8, the airlift achieved a crushing, relentless momentum. The stream of aircraft became a flood. The parking aprons at Rhein-Main, Hahn, and other supporting airfields resembled a bizarre, ultramodern automotive lot, filled not with cars, but with the most advanced armored vehicles in the world, their camouflage patterns stark under the halogen lights. The noise was a constant, deafening symphony, the shriek of jet engines, the deep-throated growl of tank turbines, the shouted commands of sergeants, and the static crackle of 1,000 radios. This was the physical, undeniable proof the Soviet observers were documenting. But the true climax was not merely photographic. It was cognitive. In the Kremlin Situation Room and within the KGB's Analytical Directorate, the streams of intelligence from Able Archer and REFORGER merged into a single, terrifying narrative. From Able Archer, NATO's simulated alert level was moving to DEFCON 1. Communications were using never-before-heard formats and codes. The exercise involved the highest levels of political leadership, including, in the simulation, the President of the United States and the British Prime Minister. The scenario had escalated through a conventional war to the point of nuclear release authorization. To the KGB officers tasked with finding signs of Ryan, this was not a game. It was the authentic preparatory pattern for a surprise attack. And now, from REFORGER, they were seeing the conventional spearhead materializing to follow that theoretical nuclear strike. The speed was the key. It invalidated the Soviet Union's fundamental strategic assumption, that they would have weeks of warning from NATO's slow seaborne reinforcement. That warning time had just collapsed to 72 hours. The prepositioned stocks, once theorized, were now seen to be vast and fully functional. The airlift capacity was not theoretical, it was operational at a scale that defied their own logistical planning. The turning point arrived when this analysis crystallized at the highest level of the Soviet state. General Secretary Yuri Andropov, a former KGB chief whose worldview was shaped by conspiracy and confrontation, lay gravely ill in a sanitarium. But the reports reaching him and the Politburo painted a picture of imminent attack. According to later accounts from Soviet defectors and archived Politburo notes, the Soviet leadership genuinely believed, for a period of several days, that NATO was using the exercises as cover for the real thing. In response, the Soviet military took tangible, lethal steps off the chessboard and into reality. They placed nuclear-capable aircraft in Poland and East Germany on heightened alert. They reportedly moved intermediate-range missile units to their field deployment sites. Most chillingly, they ordered a stand-down of their military communications for a period, a move meant to complicate NATO's ability to target their command network in a first strike, but one that also dangerously increased the risk of miscalculation by isolating their own units. The climax of REFORGER 83 was therefore not a battle, but a mutual, breathless stare over the nuclear abyss. The stunning of Soviet generals was not mere professional admiration for a logistical feat, it was the visceral, paralyzing shock of realizing their strategic paradigm was obsolete and that the adversary they feared most possessed both the intent, as they misread it, and an unprecedented capability to act on it with devastating speed. The 72-hour airlift did not just deliver an army to Germany, it delivered a profound and terrifying message to Moscow: the window for any preemptive action had just slammed shut. The margin for error had vanished. For NATO commanders monitoring Soviet reactions through their own intelligence, this was the moment of supreme, chilling validation, and peril. Their demonstration of capability had been too convincing. The psychological operation had potentially triggered the very thing it was designed to prevent. The world hovered at a threshold far more dangerous than the ramps of the C-5 galaxies. The exercise had succeeded beyond its wildest logistical dreams, but in doing so, it had brought the Cold War to a fever pitch of existential dread from which it would take careful, quiet diplomacy to step back. The aircraft would eventually return to the United States. The soldiers would fly home. But the strategic landscape had been irrevocably altered. The consequences of those 72 hours in November would ripple through military doctrines, intelligence assessments, and the very fabric of East-West relations for the remainder of the Cold War. As the last C-141 departed Rhein-Main Air Base, the cold arithmetic of the exercise was tallied. The numbers were staggering. In under 72 hours, the United States had airlifted more than 8,000 soldiers of the 1st Cavalry Division's key combat elements from Texas to West Germany. They were married up with over 1,900 pieces of heavy equipment drawn from the POMCAS sites, including hundreds of M1 Abrams tanks and M2 Bradley fighting vehicles. The air bridge had utilized hundreds of sorties by Military Airlift Command and Civil Reserve Air Fleet aircraft, a seamless fusion of military and civilian airlift that proved the concept of total mobilization. On the ground in West Germany, the first team didn't just arrive, they deployed. Within hours of linking up with their equipment, units were conducting tactical maneuvers in the freezing forests and fields of the Grafenwehr and Hohenfels training areas. They were integrated into V Corps' defensive plans, fighting simulated battles against opposing force, units playing the Warsaw Pact role. The message was unequivocal: this was not a symbolic gesture. It was a combat-ready force, capable of moving from peacetime garrison to European front line in the time it took for a long weekend to pass. For NATO allies, the relief was palpable, mixed with awe. The security guarantee had been made flesh and steel. But in the East, the aftermath was one of profound disquiet and escalating fear. The KGB and GRU, their worst suspicions seemingly confirmed by the flawless execution of REFORGER combined with the aberrant signals from Able Archer, continued to flood Moscow with warnings. While the immediate peak of panic subsided after the exercises concluded on November 11, the underlying crisis did not dissipate. The Soviet leadership was left with a chilling new assessment of their strategic position. The aftermath for them was a series of grim conclusions. First, NATO's ability to reinforce was not a bluff, it was an operational reality of breathtaking speed. Second, the new American weapons systems, the Pershing II, the cruise missiles, and now the M1 Abrams tank deployed in force, were qualitatively superior. Third, and most dangerously, they believed the Reagan administration was both ideologically committed to destroying the Soviet Union and capable of executing a surprise attack. The war scare of 1983 did not end with the exercises, it deepened into a prolonged state of heightened alert and strategic paralysis within the Kremlin. This Soviet reaction did not go unnoticed in the West. Western intelligence agencies, particularly Britain's MI6 and the CIA, began to intercept and analyze the frantic Soviet communications and unusual military movements that had occurred during Able Archer/REFORGER. A slow, chilling realization dawned in Washington and London: the Soviets had not merely been posturing. They had genuinely been scared. They had believed the exercise was real. This was perhaps the most significant immediate aftermath of all. The West glimpsed the true depth of Soviet paranoia. The mask of monolithic, confident aggression had slipped, revealing a leadership driven by fear and prone to catastrophic miscalculation. This intelligence would fundamentally reshape Western approaches to crisis management for the remainder of the Cold War. The world had passed through a corridor of extreme danger without even realizing its full extent at the time. The immediate aftermath was a quiet but profound shift in the understanding of the balance of terror. Deterrence had been stress-tested to its absolute limit, and the system had held, but only just. The engineers of that system now had to grapple with the fact that their most convincing demonstration of strength had nearly triggered the very war it was meant to prevent. The tremors of November 1983 would extend far beyond the training grounds of Germany. They would influence military doctrine for a generation, accelerate the economic and psychological unraveling of the Soviet Empire, and redefine what global power projection meant in the modern age. The operational success of REFORGER 83, set against the harrowing backdrop of the 1983 war scare, cast a long and definitive shadow over the final decade of the Cold War. Its consequences were felt in doctrine, technology, and the ultimate fate of the Soviet Union. First, it served as the ultimate validation of the airland battle doctrine. This U.S. Army doctrine, formally adopted in 1982, was designed to fight and win against a numerically superior Warsaw Pact. It emphasized agility, deep strikes against second-echelon forces, and the seamless integration of air and land power. REFORGER proved its foundational logistical premise, that the US could not only conceive of such a fight, but could actually deliver the forces to execute it on a timeline that matched the doctrine's aggressive tempo. The sight of M1 Abrams and M2 Bradleys rolling into German woodlands within hours of arrival turned airland battle from a theoretical manual into an imminent, terrifying reality for Soviet planners. Second, the exercise catalyzed a relentless focus on strategic mobility as a core component of American military power. The C-5 Galaxy and C-141 Starlifter were heroes of the moment, but planners saw their limitations. The drive for an even more capable airlifter gained unstoppable momentum, culminating in the development of the C-17 Globemaster III, an aircraft designed from the outset to carry outsized cargo and land on short, austere runways closer to the front. REFORGER 83 was the concrete proof of concept that justified the billions invested in global airlift capacity, an investment that would pay dividends in every conflict from the Gulf War to the present day. Perhaps the most profound long-term consequence was the psychological and economic pressure it placed on the Soviet Union. The Kremlin was forced to confront an agonizing dilemma. To counter NATO's ability to rapidly reinforce, they would need to maintain even larger standing forces along the inner German border, at astronomical cost. Alternatively, they would need to develop a comparable strategic airlift of their own, a capability their industry and economy could not possibly match. The Soviet airlift fleet, centered on the IL-124 and IL-76, was formidable for regional power projection, but it could never replicate the transoceanic scale of the U.S. civil military air bridge. REFORGER highlighted a fundamental asymmetry: the Soviet Union was a continental power, the United States was a global power, with a network of allies and the means to reach them almost instantly. This realization contributed to the growing sense of inevitable defeat within the Soviet military and political elite. They were in a technology and logistics race they could not win, draining a stagnant economy to counter a demonstration that underscored their own strategic incarceration. Finally, the 1983 crisis, with REFORGER at its heart, necessitated a deliberate de-escalation in communications. Shaken by intelligence revealing how close they had come to the brink, Western leaders, particularly Ronald Reagan, began to seek a change in tone. Within a year, Reagan's rhetoric softened. His meeting with the new Soviet leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, in Geneva in 1985, initiated a series of summits aimed at building trust and reducing nuclear arsenals. The experience of 1983 served as a sobering lesson for both superpowers, that exercises and rhetoric could be as dangerous as weapons themselves. The relentless, demonstrative pressure of exercises like REFORGER continued, but they were increasingly paired with diplomatic overtures, creating a dual-track strategy of undeniable strength and open dialogue that would eventually help coax the Cold War to a peaceful conclusion. The airlift of November 1983 thus stands not as an isolated feat, but as a pivotal hinge in history. It was the moment the Cold War's logistical theory became a destabilizing fact, terrifying an adversary into a crisis, and ultimately forcing a recalibration of the very relationship that had brought the world to the edge. The sound of those landing gear touching down was the sound of an old strategic assumption, the safety of time and distance, crumbling. From the frozen tarmac of Rhine-Main to the agitated halls of the Kremlin, the event left an indelible mark. But what does it mean for us now, in a world where the shadows of great power competition have lengthened once more? The roar of the galaxies has faded into history. The soldiers of that first team have long since hung up their uniforms. The Ponkas sites in Germany, once the linchpin of a continent's defense, have been largely dismantled. The Cold War itself exists in archives, documentaries, and the fading memories of those who lived under its shadow. Yet, the 72-hour airlift of November 1983 endures as more than a historical footnote or a logistical record. It stands as a definitive case study in the theater of power. True power, in the geopolitical sense, is not merely the possession of weapons, but the demonstrated ability to project and sustain them anywhere, at a time and pace of one's own choosing. REFORGER 83 was that demonstration in its purest, most cinematic form. It translated economic might, technological ingenuity, and organizational genius into an irrefutable strategic fact on the ground. It proved that will, when married to capability, could compress time and space to its own advantage. The event also lays bare the dual-edged nature of deterrence. The airlift was designed to prevent war by showcasing an unbearable cost to any aggressor. Yet, in its flawless execution during a moment of acute paranoia, it very nearly triggered the catastrophe it was meant to avert. This is the eternal, perilous paradox of military preparedness. The tools and demonstrations meant to ensure peace can, through a haze of fear and miscalculation, become the catalysts for conflict. The stunned Soviet generals were not just awed by a technical feat, they were frozen by a new and terrifying variable in their existential equation. The lesson is one of profound responsibility, that strength must be tempered with an acute, empathetic awareness of how that strength is perceived by an adversary living in a different reality. Finally, the 1983 airlift serves as a bridge between eras. It was the climactic performance of a Cold War strategy built on massive, fixed alliances and linear fronts. But the capabilities it honed, global strategic airlift, rapid force projection, the integration of reserve and active components, became the foundational toolkit for the New World disorder that followed. The same C-5s that fed the Fulda Gap scenario would, within a decade, deliver armored brigades to the deserts of Saudi Arabia for Operation Desert Shield, at an even more astonishing pace. The doctrine validated in German forests would be executed in Iraqi plains. In the end, the story of America airlifting an entire army to Germany in 72 hours is not just a story of airplanes and tanks. It is a story about the weight of a promise. A promise to allies, written in the language of logistics and resolve. A promise that would not be broken, because it could not be broken. It remains a stark reminder that in the high-stakes calculus of global security, the most powerful weapon is sometimes not a missile in a silo, but the demonstrated ability to keep your word, against all odds, at a moment's notice. The contrails over the Atlantic have long since dissipated, but the shadow they cast, of power, peril, and the relentless, ticking clock of decision, stretches into our present, and undoubtedly, into our future.